Hi, everyone. Welcome to Social Studies Online. My name is Eden Cho, and I'm a museum educator at the National Museum of American History. We're so excited to have you here with us today. We'll spend the next half an hour talking about an important social studies question: how do we form a more perfect union? And this is an especially exciting question to discuss in the midst of an election year. And today's session is especially exciting because we have not one, but two guests from the Smithsonian American Art Museum today. So before I turn it over to our host, I do want to encourage everyone to ask us any questions during our time here. And the way to do that is to comment in the chat box. We also encourage you to not post any personal identifiable information in the chat box. If you're a parent or educator watching with a young person today, we hope you'll participate together and discuss this question in your own homes. We'll share a link with all of the resources you see here today at the end of our time together. And we hope you enjoy. And I'm going to turn over the introductions now to Orlando Serrano.
All right, thank you, Eden. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you all today. And as Eden pointed out, our question, our topic for today is, how do we form a more perfect union? And at this time, I'd like our two guests to introduce themselves a little bit to us, and then we'll go from there.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Dale Dynas. I work at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I am the Teacher Programs Coordinator.
And hi, everyone. My name is Phoebe Hilleman. I also work at the Smithsonian American Art Museum with Elizabeth, and I'm the Teacher Institute's educator. So we both work on teacher programs and with students. I manage our National Summer Teacher Institutes.
Excellent. And I'm Orlando Serrano, and I'm the manager for youth and teacher programs at the National Museum of American History. Now, before we get started, we want to give folks an opportunity to maybe come up with some questions that they have about our topic for today. And to give everybody a little bit of time to do that, I'd like to ask Elizabeth and Phoebe to say a little bit more about themselves, what kind of work they do at the museum, and how they ended up there. So Elizabeth, what are some of the details of your day-to-day, and how did you end up at SAM?
So day to day, I am working with teachers and students on how artwork can tell us stories about the United States, stories about sort of universal human experiences, and then also how we can better understand ourselves as learners. So I'll be in the gallery doing that work or going out to schools. And I came to be at the Smithsonian American Art Museum after a lot of work in nonprofit organizations.
Excellent. Thank you, Elizabeth. And Phoebe, how about yourself?
Yeah. So my path to SAM started when I was in college, and I decided to study art history. But really the reason that I was drawn to art history was, for me, I realized that it was the most powerful way that I had ever figured out how to learn history. I realized in my art history courses that I was learning so much about American history, world history, that I was retaining better learning it through images than I ever had in a history classroom. So that connection sort of led me to museum education and my current work, where I think about artwork in a very interdisciplinary way, thinking about how we can use it to learn American history, to learn about literature and writing and science. So that's how I came at my work and how I think about it today.
Well, that's really interesting. I was actually an art history major, one of my first majors, before I had several, and no one needs to know what all my majors were. But for similar reasons, I felt that, looking at a piece of art made the historical context, what was happening at the time, a little bit more sticky, and I was able to grab onto it. But it has been a while since I, did all that art history work. So hopefully, as we work through some of these resources today, you all can help us learn and practice ways to analyze some of this art. Sometimes that could be intimidating. We might find a piece of art interesting or beautiful, but we don't know why or how to talk about it. So hopefully today we can get at some of those as well. Okay, well, let's get started. Our first resource that we have, this is the first one that we have. Let me go back one slide.
I need to
All
go
right.
back a bit more, I think, Orlando.
One more? All right.
Maybe 2 more.
There we go.
You're getting a
All right.
preview, everyone. That's awesome.
Yeah. All right. So Elizabeth, what do we have? Not yet. One more. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
1 more.
Yeah. Learning Lab is being a little bit fickle today. There we go.
There we go.
All right. So Phoebe, I've been to SAM. Sorry, folks, for folks who don't know what SAM is, Smithsonian American Art Museum. I apologize if we're using acronyms just out of habit, but that's what SAM is. And so, Phoebe, I've been to SAM several times, and I really, really enjoy this, in large part because it reminds me of my kid, who anytime we take a road trip, he writes down the names of all the states and looks for license plates. Sometimes he completes it, sometimes he doesn't. But so what do we have here? Tell us about this, please.
Yeah, I think that's a really common experience. I remember doing the same thing. So for this piece, I would really recommend just talking about, strategies for looking at art. I always like to start with just kind of a close look before we talk about what the artwork is, what it's called, what's going on. So thank you for using that zoom feature. If we could just kind of scroll from top to bottom, people who are tuning in, maybe just take a close look and start thinking about what you see and see if you can sort of make sense of what might be going on here. And feel free to jump in the chat box if you have any ideas. But I'll tell you a little bit more in just a moment. So Orlando, you noticed that this piece obviously is made up of a number of different license plates. And there are actually 51 license plates depicted here, one for each of the 50 states and Washington, D.C. Okay. They're arranged in alphabetical order. And as many of you may have noticed in the chat box, each license plate sort of has these little strange fragments of words that don't make a lot of sense individually. But when you start reading them out all together, phonetically, it actually forms the preamble to the US Constitution. So if you start at that top row, reading from left to right, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, so on and so forth. So it's kind of this fun puzzle, but it takes a minute to figure out when you're first looking at it. And then once it clicks, you're sort of like, oh, I get it. At least that's been my experience. So this piece was actually created by an artist named Mike Wilkins. It's called Preamble.
Okay.
And it was made in 1987 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the signing of the US Constitution. So in order to make this piece, it is made out of 51 real license plates. So as you can imagine, thinking about how do you acquire 51 real license plates that have these specific letter combinations from 50 states and DC, as you can imagine, that's a little complicated. So Wilkins actually had to go to the DMV for each of these states and request a vanity license plate, which is challenging for many reasons. Obviously, each DMV has their own rules, and it was a little tricky to figure that out. But he eventually put this piece together, and what we end up with is this collection of different license plates. If you look at them closely, they're made up of different colors. They have different designs. Some of the license plates have particular phrases, as you may have noticed, going on a road trip or driving down the highway. But they're all sort of in this standardized shape and format, and they come together to form this larger whole.
Now, Phoebe, I have a question.
Yeah.
So do you know, in terms of the process here, did the artist have all the phrases that he wanted from each state, or was it sort of like an iterative process where he went to one state and then, like let's say he went to Ohio and said, I'd like to do in our, whatever, but that was already taken and he had to, revise it? Do we know if he had to do that often?
Yeah, I don't know for sure about specific states and specific phrases, but I believe there was some iteration that had to go on there. And you know, working with individual DMVs around the country, I can't even imagine how challenging that process would
Or
be.
the lines. Let's be real. Like the lines.
Exactly.
I don't even know what those lines would have been like. And maybe North Dakota would have been nicer than California, but it's still, it's a line.
Yeah.
Well, so Phoebe, why start here? Why did you all decide to start us here in our topic today about a more perfect union?
Yeah, great question. So obviously, the phrase "a more perfect union" comes from the preamble to the Constitution. So that was an obvious connection right there. But more than that, the reason we wanted to start with this artwork is really this metaphor that it suggests through the way that it was made, about, what is the United States? It's a collection of diverse places and people with diverse belief systems, values, backgrounds. So how do we all work together to decide on what it means to to form a more perfect union, when everybody might have their own opinion about that? So in this piece, each license plate is different, but this piece wouldn't work if any of them was missing.
Yeah.
So we've got sort of this idea of out of many one captured in an artwork. So I think we wanted to start here just to sort of think about that metaphor of, how do we grapple with this question that is central to our democracy when we all are so different, and what brings us together? How do we decide how to move forward to make our country better? So that's kind of why we were starting here.
Well, yeah, and that's really interesting. And, we can sort of tack on to that metaphor or extend it and think about how all of these are also unintelligible, sort of individually, and they have to be put together to make any kind of sense, as we think about the country. And it's very difficult to make sense of some of these places on their own because they are so tied into a national history now. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Let's see what our next resource is here. Okay.
Quite
all right,
different.
Elizabeth. Yeah, Elizabeth, tell us about this and how are we connecting this to our previous license plate extravaganza?
Yeah, so we have a quilt here, and I appreciate very much what Wilkins did in that last piece about taking small pieces of things and putting them together to create a whole that is so much larger than each individual part. And so this idea of kind of extending the metaphor into quilts is where I was going with this selection. And in order to make sense of it, I wonder if we could do just a little thinking routine, like you kind of teed off at the start.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I think sometimes when we look at something like this, it might be hard to figure out where do you start looking. So I'm actually going to ask you to zoom out all the way so that people who are participating can look all over the artwork and just kind of start to capture maybe 5 things that you think are worth noting. And I'm going to ask you to zoom back in and just pan from the top to the bottom of the artwork. And as you get closer, think about, okay, what are something that I can add to my list? Is there something that I can see now that I couldn't see when I was standing further away from it? So if you're participating in the chat box, feel free to put your thoughts there. But you're thinking about, what do you notice about this quilt? So Orlando, what maybe are 2 things that you notice off the bat?
Thank you, because that's exactly how many things I was able to write down. So, I noticed little sort of curly Q strings and what appear to be pockets from, I'm assuming, jeans.
Okay, talk to me about the pockets, because that may not be obvious to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, all right, these definitely right here. So we've got, it looks like an upside down pocket from like a back of what might be a mom or dad jean. Those are very large pockets.
They're big pockets. Yep.
Or maybe an overall.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with the context of a quilt, these little curly pieces of yarn remind me of quilts that my abuelita used to make out of like old pillowcases or, you know, napkins, literally anything that she could find. And it's really sort of both a positive and a negative memory, because I remember how colorful they were, because they were so put together from various different materials. They were texturally rich, but they also were scratchy.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm curious with this one, is it soft like my jeans? Because I'm very, very, you know, addicted to my denim, you know, and I'm curious about how this would have felt if I want to touch it.
Yeah, so I've never touched this quilt, but I can guess based on some things that I know about it. So just to like back up, just to give a little bit of information about quilt making that Orlando's already started to kind of talk us through. We have this top layer, and then we have a middle part. Usually that's that soft, fluffy stuff. And then there's a bottom layer. And then you have to figure out, how am I going to make this sandwich stay together so that when, you know, my grandson is rolling up in a quilt to watch TV or whatever, so all the parts don't fall apart. So those little curly cues that Orlando was noticing are knots. So this is a hand knotted quilt that's kind of connecting all of those layers. To this question about would it be soft, I'm going to guess it would be soft because, like Orlando noticed, this is made of old jeans. So then we might start to think about like, well, how do jeans feel after you've worn and washed them for a long time? So like, you know, your pair of jeans, that really old friend, right? But then you're starting to think maybe that's why there's these pocket shapes, right? So like, that's the part that the sun has not been on. So if you've been outside in your jeans, you might notice that they start to fade. The more you wash them, the more they fade. So then we start to think about and maybe start unpacking, what is the life that these jeans lived before it became a quilt?
No, that's interesting. Do we know where? Well, who? First of all, let's see who made this, and do we know the story of some of these jeans?
So this is a really interesting question to get into when we're starting to look at folk or self-taught art. So this is kind of the umbrella term that we use to catch things that are usually made at home for a purpose that have some kind of aesthetic or artistic value. So in a lot of cases, we don't know who made quilts. So this is the work of women in their homes. We think that this quilt was made in the 1940s. And quilts like this kind of came about because people were living with shortages, right? So you're thinking about what's happening in the 1940s. You've just come out of the Great Depression. You're just moving in or through World War II. There's not a lot of stuff available. Then we might just start to unpack for certain classes in our country, the availability of materials is even less ready, right? So, okay, I'm a mom. I'm looking all around my house. I know I want to keep my kid warm. What do I have available? I have scraps. I have little bits and pieces of t-shirts or whatever. In this case, this quilter was looking at a pile of work clothes. So the old pants, right, that somebody was wearing out to do physical labor. The pants have been used up, but only if we think of them only as pants. They get a new life if we look at them in a new way. And so the quilters like this one were trying to figure out how to make do with little and how to innovate and improvise. So this style of quilting is quite different than the really formal quilts that you might have seen. Those are largely European American traditions. This tradition of improvised quilt falls more often into African American communities. And so this is like a really rich, like we can start taking a quilt apart and realize there's a lot of history, whether it's family history or also the history of the U.S.
That's great. I really like the metaphor of taking different pieces that may seem inarticulate or unrelated, and when you put them together, we get something that's a different kind of whole.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's continue here. All right, this also looks like a quilt. I mean, if based on our previous
trend.
seeing exercises, can you guide us through this cultural resource, please?
Yeah. Okay. So first time I was asking you just to look for stuff like you noticed the knots and you noticed the pockets. Now I'm going to ask you to look with the intention of thinking about connections. So as you're looking, is there anything that you can connect to prior knowledge? So is there anything in there that looks familiar to you that you might be able to build a bridge, Orlando?
Yeah, well, this also definitely looks like leftovers, right? So if we're connecting it to our previous quote, so the idea of making do, this right here that's spread across two different strips looks to me like the diagrams that I've seen of slave ships.
Yep.
And this looks like Malcolm X.
Okay.
In glasses, and I'm not sure who this gentleman is here.
Cool.
And this looks like a globe, but from a different perspective. Like, you know, in the United States, we're used to seeing a globe sort of with the United States in the middle, but here it looks like the ocean is in the middle.
Cool.
So those are the things that I've noticed.
Awesome. So let's start to bridge to the next section. So I'm showing this to you in bits and pieces purposefully, because sometimes when we look at something that's really big and complex, it's really hard to make sense of it. Like if you're looking at, let's try to explain the whole United States, like that is kind of a big challenge, right? So let's zoom in and look at the parts and then zoom out to see how all those parts work together. So again, if you'll just zoom in here, like what additional connections can you find?
I see Martin Luther King, which looks like an image from the famous speech on Washington.
Yep.
A different picture of MLK up there and another one down here. So that very MLK-centric strip we have here. And here as well, we've got what looks like the and it says it here, classic, the letter from Birmingham jail.
Yeah.
I'm not sure here. So it definitely looks like I can make out the word extremist, and definitely towards the end of MLK's life, folks started talking about him in the Poor People's Campaign as an extreme measure. And then this looks like Quilt. I mean, you know, and I'm thinking about what you said earlier about
patchwork.
Yeah, the patchwork especially within the African American tradition, where you're piecing together different parts. Okay.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. So let's see the whole thing. I just want to let you know, Lemercy Fraser is the woman who created this particular work. And she overall is interested in self-reliance and then also the contributions of African Americans throughout history. So with this artwork, which she made in 1996, so well after the assassination of Dr. King, she says she's deifying him. So she's like putting him into a structure that kind of elevates him to a godlike level. It contains excerpts from his life and from his speeches, but the way that she chose to format this quilt is directly relating to African traditional quilts. So she's including like kind of this idea of reaching back through history in order to go toward the future, right? And then what she's done in part is with those excerpts that you were starting to kind of tease out, she's calling our attention to a particular moment in MLK's life. And she titled this Letter from Birmingham Jail, MLK. So on the 16th of April in 1963, Dr. King wrote this 21-page letter from a jail in Birmingham, Alabama. He had gone there to protest the segregation of spaces there and was arrested alongside 50 other people. But the things that I kind of want to pull out, the quotes that I want to pull out that connect both to our theme and then also kind of what we're going through together right now, is in that letter he wrote, "I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And I love that idea of being part of a garment because it connects beautifully to my metaphor. But then I thought also he goes on at the very end of this letter, and this is where I start to think about what we're going through together right now. He wrote this really, really long letter, and then he says, "Never before have I written so long a letter. I'm afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell other than write long letters, think long thoughts, and pray long prayers? And I just love the idea that like he's in confinement and he's finding space and opportunity within that. And I think that connects in a lot of different ways to our theme. So we have an artist who's elevating the voice of somebody who is agitating for change, but we also have an artist who is reaching into the future by also pulling on tradition. And I think those kind of threads seem to wind throughout of our history, and also toward this idea of how do we create a more perfect union.
That's great. And it's a wonderful visualization of the coming together MLK talked about. Well, thank you, Elizabeth.
Sure.
Now, we have a few more minutes. We're going to go through a couple more resources. If you do have any questions, please make sure you put them in the chat box.
You have some comments and questions. Janet says, hi, on the West Coast, so I missed the beginning. Well, no worries, Janet. All of our videos are archived at the same link, so you'll be able to watch the beginning at a later time. And she asks, are these pieces all from one Smithsonian museum? And I'd like to add on to that question of if the Smithsonian museums were open, would these objects be on view?
Great question. So to answer Janet's original question, yes, all of these works that we've been looking at are from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And we're going to show you at the end here, these are all part of a collection we've created on the Smithsonian Learning Lab. So we'll show you how to access that, so you'll be able to find all of these artworks. And as to the question of whether they would be on view if the museum was open, some of them, yes, some of them, no. Actually, only about 5%, I think, of the total artworks that the museum owns are on view at any given time. Which a lot of people don't know. So I know the Mike Wilkins preamble piece is on view, but I don't think either of the other quilts we've looked at would be.
And Christian did make a comment saying, I think it's a type of bed sheet, the object that we just looked at before, tied with some unique objects, and every object can tell a history about a culture. And love to echo that sentiment that yes, we love objects, we love storytelling, and making those connections.
Thank you, Eden, and thank you, Christian, because that provides a segue here to Phoebe, since I've got you. We've got about 5 more minutes here. Okay. This also looks like a quilt. I appreciate that y'all found all the quilts. That's great. And I think I know what this is just because I'm trained as a geographer. But Phoebe, can you guide us through, like, let's pretend, we don't know. How would we start thinking about this?
Yeah. So again, I would always start with just a slow, close look. So if you want to just zoom in a little bit and move over this artwork, which is also a quilt, you've hit upon our theme there. You might start to notice lines and shapes and different colors that may form some patterns. Some of them maybe not so much. You also might notice textures the closer we are able to zoom in. So Orlando, I'd love to hear what you're thinking about this piece.
Okay, so I have no idea what these red tick marks are. However, like I said, I appreciate a good map, and I am very attuned to the idea of place because I'm a geographer. And these diagonals hitting squares and circles remind me of the city that I live in, which is DC. So, but I don't know where we are in DC because, quite frankly, these diagonals are everywhere. So I would like a little bit more context to know where in DC we are.
Yeah, well, you're right. This is a map, or it's a quilt based on a map of a part of DC. So if you go to the next slide, I actually have a Google map screenshot for you there. Okay. So This is actually a little neighborhood that's part of Northeast DC. We see parts of Capitol Hill there. Actually, it's Northeast and Southeast. Capitol Hill, Lincoln Park, the Capitol building is on the left-hand side there. So you see these parks and these big diagonal avenues cutting through them. So this map is created to tell a particular story, as some quilts are. This quilt is created by an artist named Catherine Clark. It was made in 2015, so it's the most recent quilt we've looked at so far. And this is called Washington DC Foreclosure Quilt,
Wow.
which gives us a hint as to what those red marks mean on the quilt. So this is actually depicting all of the foreclosed buildings in this neighborhood of DC at the time that it was created in 2015. So Clark actually worked as an urban planner for a few years in the early 2000s. She's also been an artist for over 20 years. And she started reading about the foreclosure crisis that started happening around the time of the recession in 2008, and started thinking about, she's reading about all these statistics in the news, but she didn't actually know how to see what that looked like, see the effects of it. So she decided to make quilts based on these maps showing all of these buildings that were foreclosed. So this is part of a larger series of neighborhoods in many different cities around the US. This isn't a problem that was just in DC. This was a national issue.
Now that's one. So I appreciate the ways that this is, an historically Black city, the through line that we have through all the quilts that we've looked at today. And I'm also interested to see the other cities now. I was unaware that this is part of a series, and that'd be, do you happen to know, Phoebe, if there's one for Milwaukee where that book Evicted is based in? That'd be interesting to map those on.
I don't know for sure.
Okay.
Catherine Clark's website has a number of images of other works in her series, so you could look her up and check. But yeah, it's really interesting to look at some of the others. They all look different. You can tell, certain neighborhoods were harder hit than others. And one of the interesting things about this map or this series is she has actually cut out holes where those foreclosed buildings are. Oh. So she's physically making the quilt more fragile, more vulnerable than it would have been otherwise, which kind of mirrors, what happens to neighborhoods when buildings are foreclosed and vacant. This idea of making the neighborhood more vulnerable, more fragile.
Well, and if we think about, that's a great way to sort of tie into what happens when you take any parts out, right? The larger whole is made weaker. And if we think about, again, the more perfect union, when we start taking folks out, what are we doing to that larger whole?
Yeah, exactly. So I just thought this piece fit in really well with the theme, just this idea of Catherine Clark using her craft to document this crisis and educate people about it. Sometimes just making people aware of a crisis or an issue can be a step towards creating change.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phoebe. All right, we're gonna go with one more.
I promise I'll fly. I promise.
Elizabeth, what do we have here? Except, I can see that it's a jacket, and I know that I want it.
Yeah.
So please tell us the story behind this.
Yeah, I'm gonna do this really quickly. This is an artist who is grappling with some things that similarly, he's recognizing some things that are troubling to him. His name is Garner, and one of the things that troubles him is the way that we use resources. So particularly when we start thinking about fast fashion and the toll that fashion takes on our world, that's what he's kind of like trying to address with his work. So sometimes what he's doing is actually growing the plants that he uses to dye his fabrics. Other times, like in this case, he goes to antique shops and people's attics and he finds quilts that are no longer being used, and he turns them into something new. So this is following that thread of innovation. But in his case, this is a man who grew up in Tennessee. He grew up in this old Civil War town. He's looking around and kind of thinking about the land. So recognizing that, you know, land ownership and the expansiveness of the land has been kind of a core component of American history. And now we're in a phase of maybe not thinking as much or thinking as reliantly on the land as we had been. He wants to kind of just bring that to the fore by creating something beautiful, unexpected, something really eye-catching, like you can see on the screen, with something that basically took little to no toll on the land. And what he says is, I love nature, so I don't want to make anything that may harm it or may destroy it. So just to like put a pin in this one, what I really thought, how this connected to that kind of larger metaphor of many one, and then also building a more perfect union. I really appreciated the idea of using and reusing, looking at the way things were done before and iterating and innovating, but then also kind of recognizing that there are needs that can be met by one's own action. And rather than sitting in sadness, choosing to do something. And I think those kind of core values are part of what help us bind together and also stay together.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, I really like the idea of, again, making doer. You know, newer is not always better. What can we do with what we have now?
Yeah.
All right. Well, Phoebe, it looks like we're back to where we started. So how do we want to wrap this up here?
I know we're just about out of time. Just wanted to bring it back to where we started and think about this metaphor that we've been playing with for the last half hour of, you know, out of many one, you know, creating something whole from many pieces, which is sort of what all of these quilts have been doing as well. So just wanted to leave you with thinking about quilts perhaps as a metaphor for our country. You know, we hear about the melting pot, or sometimes it's called a salad bowl, but maybe a quilt could be another metaphor that we could play with here. And thinking about, you know, just what values do all of these quilts that we looked at hold, and how are those related to American values? Things about creating with what you have, and tradition and community, are some of the ideas that are rolling around in my mind. So I just wanted to kind of leave us there, and I hope people will continue to think about their own ideas and connections beyond this webinar.
Thank you. Well, Elizabeth and Phoebe, thank you for your time. That was wonderful. Eden, I'm not sure if we have any more questions. We can try and tackle a couple more. We don't want to, you know, overstep our welcome with something. If they have questions, we're happy to stick around.
Not too many questions, but a few comments. Janet instantly saw DC as well. Christian thought that the coat was really beautiful. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. In the comment box is the link for the Learning Lab collection with resources from today's session, and the Smithsonian Distance Learning website, where you can find the calendar of all of the Smithsonian's pre-K to 12 distance learning resources across all the museums in different subject areas. But we will be here every Thursday morning at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. Next week, we'll explore the question, what is the role of the United States in the world? And breaking news, you heard it here first, folks. Starting next week, we're also offering Spanish versions of the same webcasts at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you know any educators and students who are English language learners or learning Spanish as an additional language, we'll explore the same question at a later time in Spanish. So all videos, including this one, will be archived, so you can come back and rewatch anytime at the same link. And we hope you stay safe and healthy during this time. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.